In 1966, specifically on July 14th, the residents of a neighborhood in Chicago were awakened by hysterical screams coming from a nearby nurse's residence. Neighbors rushed to the house, and many called the police. Everyone was shocked to see Nurse Corazon Amurao standing on the edge of an upstairs window, screaming hysterically for help. A group of men from the neighborhood broke into the house to rescue the distressed nurse. Inside, the scene was even more horrifying. Bodies of her fellow nurses were strewn about the dormitory. Everyone froze in terror at the sight, and soon the police arrived, helping Corazon down amid the stunned onlookers. Corazon was the only one who could explain what had happened inside the house. The police secured the area and took Corazon to the hospital, where they found no physical injuries on her, but she was in a state of severe psychological distress. Investigators then went to the house to move the bodies and search the crime scene. The police found the point of entry on the ground floor, a window next to which lay a knife used by the intruder. But the pressing question was, who was the intruder? Was it just one person or more? The police waited for Corazon to calm down, as she was the only witness to the massacre. Corazon was a Filipino nurse who had come with a group of her colleagues to South Chicago Hospital as part of an exchange program. They were staying with a group of American nurses in the nurses' residence near the hospital. The nurse told the police that on the day of the incident, she returned home as usual at 9 p.m. and went to her room. At 10:30 p.m., she heard a knock on her door and thought it was one of her housemates. To her surprise, a stranger pointed a gun at her and demanded she move with him quietly. Terrified, she followed him to another room, where she found 6 of her colleagues. The intruder told them he didn't want to harm anyone. He just needed money. The frightened nurses gathered all they had, which totaled only $20. The nurses were then shocked as the intruder tore bed sheets into long strips and began tying them up, one by one. Suddenly, a noise from downstairs indicated more nurses were arriving home. The intruder quickly went downstairs, returning with another nurse. As he was tying her up, 2 more nurses came home and were also taken, but to a different room, after which silence fell. The trapped nurses sensed something terrifying was happening in the other room. The intruder returned to take another nurse, and they didn't know what was happening to her, as her departure was followed by complete silence. This pattern continued, with the intruder taking one nurse after another, and none of them returned. There were 8 nurses in total. Corazon was the last. She hid under the bed, praying that the intruder had lost count of them. Suddenly, the intruder entered the room again, but this time he searched the nurses' bags for money or valuables before leaving. The nurse remained under the bed in silent terror, not knowing what was happening or had happened outside the room, until the room owner's alarm went off at exactly 5:30 a.m. She hesitated to come out, unsure of where the killer was or what he had planned for her. Summoning her courage, she decided to leave her hiding place. She silently slipped out of the room after managing to free her hands, only to be met with a horrifying sight outside. Her friends' bodies strewn about in a dreadful state. Terrified to proceed further, she returned to the room, climbed out the window, and screamed for help, as discovered by the local residents. Corazon was able to describe the killer and provided a crucial detail. She had seen a tattoo on his hands that read, "Born to Raise Hell." The police circulated the description of the killer, who had murdered 8 nurses by stabbing and strangling them and had raped one of them, across the country. A response came from a location near the nurse's residence, where the police found a photograph of a job applicant who closely matched Corazon's description. The police took the photo to the surviving nurse, who confirmed without a doubt that he was the killer. But who was this criminal? The perpetrator of this horrific massacre was Richard Speck, a 24-year-old who had recently moved to Chicago from Texas, fleeing his criminal past that included 40 different offenses ranging from theft to assault. Richard was born on December 6, 1941, in Illinois. He was the seventh of 8 children. When he was 6 years old, his father, to whom he was very close, died of a heart attack. In 1950, his mother remarried and moved to Dallas with her new husband, taking Richard and his younger sister with her. Both children were often subjected to verbal and physical abuse by their alcoholic stepfather. As a result, Richard Speck began drinking alcohol at a young age. He was first arrested at the age of 13 and dropped out of school 3 years later. In 1962, he married a girl named Shirley Malone. Their daughter was born shortly after, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1966. Regarding the case, Richard's fingerprints from his criminal record matched those found at the nurse's house, providing conclusive evidence. A manhunt for Richard Speck ensued, leading to a strange coincidence at a modest hotel. An employee called the police to report that he had found a guest in his room who had attempted suicide. An ambulance rushed to the hotel, and upon arrival, the doctor recognized Richard and immediately notified the police. The police then asked Corazon to come to the hospital to identify Richard Speck. She agreed without hesitation to seek justice for her colleagues. She went to the hospital and, standing face to face with the murderer, screamed that he was the intruder who killed her fellow nurses. Richard was brought to trial amidst police fears that Corazon might retract her testimony due to her psychological state. However, her family came from the Philippines to support her, and she bravely confronted the killer once again in the courtroom. Richard Speck was sentenced to death by electric chair but died of natural causes in December 1991, after spending 25 years in prison. Nurse Corazon Amurao lived an ordinary, peaceful life with her husband, children, and grandchildren.